as the world prepares for another war in Israel, this time between the Jewish people and the Palestinians, I think it's pertinent for us to remember that there's going to be a lot of massive brainwashing, and the truth is going to be difficult to find in the fog of war, similar to, when Ukraine and Russia began their war, there was overwhelming support for Ukraine. It was difficult to figure out what was really happening in that region, and nowadays, support for Ukraine seems to be wavering. Here we can see Biden announced that the Hamas invaders, they're terrorist organizations attacking Israel. And that is certainly one narrative, but it may be good to understand that the world is certainly not black and white. We can call these people terrorists, but maybe we should understand what their motives really are. Now, I'm going to do my best not to get myself canceled here, so I'm going to just give a very dry description. But personally, it's always troubled me somewhat to understand, how did Israel become a country in the 1950s? Right? Like somehow we just allocated this land and it became a country, and what really happened to the people who were originally living there. And I think it's also important to understand that Israel is known as a Jewish state. And so it's kind of like how Japanese people have Japan, Russian people have Russia, so Jewish people should have Israel. And what about Christian people? Should Christian people have a Christian country as well, or should Buddhist people have a Buddhist country? Well, that's not really necessary, because a lot of these religions anybody can just join in if they want. Whereas one particular thing about Jewishness is that it is an ethno-religion. So you can't just say, hey, you know what, I'm living in Israel and I may be a Palestinian, but I'm going to just declare my religious faith to be Jewish so that I can just continue living there. No, you have to be ethnic-wise Jewish. And if you're not, you really don't have rights to that land anymore, because it's for Jewish people only, and you have to ethnically be that way. Now, either way, personally, I don't really care, because this is truly none of my business, and I don't understand the history or religion of any of I'm an atheist, okay? I don't even believe in any of these religious spiritual entities, quite frankly. I may believe in parallel universes and string theory and quantum theory, though, but we can see that Hamas has launched an unprecedented attack on Israel just today. Hamas militants entered Israel, killing at least 40 Israeli, wounding 780, launching 5,000 or so rockets into Israel, and this really begins another war. But this war has been happening since 1950 or so. Now, I found this nice series of articles from Vox, actually, which describes quite nicely the history of this region. And so I thought I would go through this and explain what's really happening in Israel between the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, who's on whose side, and what are these areas like? What is Hamas really? And if you already know this, then congratulations, you can skip the video. Alright, so what is Israel exactly, and what's Palestine? Well, interestingly, Israel did not even exist as a country before 1948. The whole area was just known as Palestine, and then through a series of wars, treaties, and battles, they formed a Jewish state known as Israel. And there are some very holy sites in this area, such as Jerusalem, that are sacred to both the Jewish and the Arabian Muslims who reside there. And so isn't it funny that, this was pretty recent, so even today there are people alive who still remember having their homes just one day randomly seized and handed over to the new Israeli government that was just formed on top of their home addresses. And this is fundamentally what the conflict is about. So you've got this region, Israel, and inside there's maybe two areas, the West Bank and Gaza. And these two areas are still heavily populated by Palestinian people, and it is heavily controlled and restricted by the Israeli Jewish government. The rest of the area is mostly occupied by Jewish people. And so then that raises the question of whether to have a two-state system shared by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, or to just wipe out one group or the other. And increasingly, as people are unable to resolve this and tensions flare, people are getting scared and risky, and they're thinking, hey, maybe they need to just wipe out one group. Now, the state of Israel really originated with Zionism, which is kind of a more radical strain of Jewish ideology. So basically, this journalist, Theodor Herzl, began writing a bunch of essays that Jewish people need their own land in 1900s or so, and this idea gained popularity, and there were two groups of Zionists who believed in this. And the more moderate group said, well, yeah, maybe they should have their own country, but it would be secular. It wouldn't be mixing religion and government too much. And then the Zionist right were more comfortable mixing religion and politics. And there were some concerns about this. For instance, in such a state, any Jew anywhere can become an Israeli citizen, but this right would not be extended to any other class of persons. So the Jewish class of people would have additional privileges and rights in this newly formed government. Whereas because this is an ethno-religion, you couldn't just say, hey, now you're Jewish. You just couldn't get the privileges because you were born non-Jewish, essentially. And so the Palestinian people were concerned that they could systematically be disenfranchised. And Arab states actually did push through a UN General Assembly resolution labeling Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination in 1975, though that was later repealed. And so what happened next was fueled on this belief that Jewish people should have their own land. Between 1900 and 1950, hundreds of thousands of Jews resettled from Europe to essentially Palestine. And many Arabs who were living there saw the influx of Jews as a colonial movement, and they began fighting bitterly. And so with so much conflict, finally, the United Nations declared in 1947 to split the land into two countries. You've got Israel and Palestine. And so about 650,000 Jews went into the blue territory on this map, displacing about 700,000 Palestinians who were living there, and they became refugees, and that formed the refugee crisis, which continues to today. And what happened was, even though the United Nations promised 56% of Palestine for the Jewish state, Israel eventually possessed more than that, 77%, and it left Israelis with the state but not the Palestinians. When the 700,000 or so Arabs were displaced, they called this the Nakba, or their word for catastrophe, and it was a single mass eviction. Today, the number of refugees has tenfolded to more than 7 million Palestinian refugees, and many of them continue to demand the right of return to their homes that their families were evicted from in 1948. Now, the problem for Israel is they cannot accept this right of return. It would be a fundamental existential crisis for them, because if 7 million Arabs suddenly showed up in their borders, the Israeli people would essentially be a minority in their own country. And then they could be outvoted because they're a democratic country, and so the whole country could just go back to the Palestinians and Israel would cease to exist, if they were to go by democratic rule at least. Now, to escalate conflict more, we have this area known as the West Bank, which is this area of land east of Israel. There's about 3 million Palestinians there. And Israel one day in 1967 decided to fire the first shots and claimed that it was some preeminent attack to try to defend itself. But since then, Israel has controlled the West Bank. And ever since they began controlling it, they began resettling this area and moving more Jewish people in there, kind of gently moving into this area. And today there are about 500,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank. And one concern is that this whole idea of settlements, or Israeli occupation of the West Bank, is something that is known as new facts on the ground, in which it just makes it harder and it blurs the boundaries between any future potential Palestinian state, because they're just slowly moving in, and this is kind of considered as a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits the transfer of population into occupied territories. Now, the Israeli government is going to dispute this, but at least for some settlers, this is exactly the point. They want the West Bank to be fully incorporated as Israeli territory, and they're trying to make that happen. All right, Jerusalem, Israel's capital and that most holiest of cities out here. What's really going on? Well, apparently for the first 20 years or so, this capital city was shared or divided between the Arabs and the Jewish people, although in 1967, Israel decided to just take control of East Jerusalem. And this annexation was actually condemned by the UN Security Council resolution, stating it as a violation of international law. And they wanted some sort of compromise solution, although basically, Israel just wanted Jerusalem and they got it in the end. Obviously, the Palestinian people aren't going to be happy with this, just loss after loss out here. So what's Gaza? It's a strip of land surrounded by Israel, populated by Palestinians. There's also the West Bank. But Gaza is essentially controlled by Hamas, which is more of a militant group out here. They're a little bit more radical, and they're the resistance against Israel. And they are essentially the group behind this new conflict. As I understand, they're funded by Iran, and they actually have quite a bit of popularity. They won political power in 2006 in a US-based election in that region. And so Hamas and other Gaza-based militants have constantly been firing rockets into Israeli targets in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and just today as well. So Hamas are like the OGs. Their charter long called for the destruction of Israel. Although recently they changed it to just say, hey, you know what? Israel's fine, they can leave it there, but they just want the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for the Palestinian people. They need some place to live, that's all they want. Although even then their mere existence may pose a threat and their existence unpalatable to the Israeli government. And to complicate matters, Hamas is the more extreme organization representing the Arabs, but then there's also the more formal government, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, which is moderated currently by Mahmoud Abbas, who's a more moderate person who's not as extreme as Hamas. Now, historically, there were also the Intifadas, which were Palestinian uprisings against Israel. There were two of these in which the Palestinians tried to peacefully protest. They would do boycotts, things like that, and they were essentially slaughtered, I believe. So the first Intifada in the 1980s was a series of Palestinian protests, demonstrations, nonviolent actions like boycotts, refusing to work, some Molotov cocktails here and there, and apparently they were met with lethal and heavy force by the Israeli military, and a lot of people died. The second Intifada was in 2000. Negotiations broke down, about 1,000 Israelis were killed, 3,200 Palestinians died, and skepticism began growing about whether a two-state agreement was even possible or if they should just wipe out one group or the other. So, weirdly, how does the world feel about Israel and Palestine? Well, apparently Israel is the fourth most disliked nation, just behind Iran, Pakistan, and North Korea. So a lot of countries have some issue with like what's really going on here, all that conflict, aggression. And so a lot of these international countries began the BDS movement, which is to boycott Israeli goods, divest of their companies, and to sanction the nation itself. Now, surrounding this area, you've got a number of countries, notably Iran, which believes fundamentally that Israel is an illegitimate state, and so they're the ones funding the Hamas rebellion group. And they're forming this axis of resistance. Israel sees Iran as an existential threat. You've also got Turkey in this area. They used to be on good terms with Israel, though they're recently becoming pro-Palestinian. And then there's Saudi Arabia, which on the one hand supports Palestine by donating them hundreds of millions of dollars, but then they're also having a working relationship with Israel because they both don't really like Iran, so they're kind of playing both sides there. All right, so which side are we on? The West? We're on Team Israel. We're on Team Israel out here. Why is that? I mean, there's some theories about why we're so buddy-buddy with Israel, but one theory is that maybe there's some pro-Israel lobby group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee or something like that, but there's just various political, governmental, capitalistic reasons and business reasons for why we would support Israel. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and we take what allies we can get. And as long as it is mutually beneficial or just beneficial for us, we'll take the deal. You see, one of the fundamental problems to this whole peace process is that Israel likes to view itself as a democracy, but they're outnumbered by the Arabs. And so if they actually have a democratic vote, they would be outvoted and the country would cease to exist. And so at this point, Israel really faces three possible outcomes, either a two-state solution or a non-democratic state governed by a Jewish minority overruling the Arab Palestinian populace and majority, which is kind of weird, but it's kind of what we have now, or the end of the Jewish state as we know it. And then, there's actually a fourth option, which is just to wipe out the Palestinians, which I think is kind of where we're going here because the Israeli prime minister announced that the enemy will pay a huge price. So he will have his revenge, and he has stated that terrorism is never justified and Israel has every right to defend itself and its people. Although I don't know if it's that black and white. If you invaded the land and you took people's homes and then you say you want to defend your home, which you took, I'm sure for the Palestinians, maybe they view themselves as the defenders against foreign invaders who they view as the terrorists, but such is the fog of war. And so all these events have led us to today, where Hamas has declared, we've decided to say enough is enough. This is the day of the greatest battle to end the last occupation on earth. As a foreign observer myself, I guess I don't really care about what happens to one side or the other. I'm just kind of here to collect the spoils of war and to side with whoever's going to win out there. And, if it seems like Israel's going to win, or if it's more to our benefit, to Western benefit, then that's the side I will be on. And we will rewrite history to make it seem like we were the good guys in the end, no matter what the case is. And so I hope that gives a brief overview of some of the conflict in this region. I was surprised to learn about it. I'm sure it goes into so much more depth and complexity and nuances. Personally, I would say, hey, maybe they should just share this area. Maybe every 10 years or so, they should just take turns, swap out the government, let the other person drive the car for a bit. Everybody kind of wants to drive. And I don't see why we all can't get along. And maybe after a few more years, people will realize none of this is real, right? This is all just made up in your head. This whole conflict, this spiritual religious zealot war, kind of like the Crusades, maybe after a while people realized it was kind of fought in vain and nobody really cared in the end one way or another. People didn't really get anything, and the whole thing may have just been a waste of time, effort, and bloodshed. And if you were to ask me, I wouldn't want Jerusalem even if you gave it to me for free. If you give me Israel, I don't want to live there. I want to live somewhere nice, like Hawaii. Yeah, tropical beaches. Japan, Yeah, I wish we took control of Japan in World War II. I would have fought to take control of that land. Maybe like San Diego, even next to the beaches. I wouldn't want to live in a desert oil field like in the Middle East, but that's just me. Hope you enjoyed the video though. But let me know in the comments below, how would you achieve peace in Israel? Or should we achieve peace in Israel? Maybe conflict is good for us. See you in the comments and see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.